So I'm going to be doing a session with mostly live coding today, with the goal of teaching how to work with forms and RCs in practice. So first about me, you saw that was a really nice intro there, but I'm from Norway. I work as a consultant at Meta, and I work in Oslo. And I'm mostly working with web development, and in my current project at my consultancy, I am actively building with RC. So I hope to share some of my experience here from that with you. So let's begin with looking at this typical single-page application. It's great. You have your React query, your React hook form, and all is well. But as we know, client-side apps have their problems. So they run purely with JavaScript, and the entire page or the entire application is constructed from JavaScript when the user opens the URL. If you're working from a slow device or a slow connection, it can take a really long time to download and execute and download, parse, and execute all this JavaScript to even load the page to, fill out a simple form, something like that. And in addition, to submit data to a database, you would want to need a backend because you can't rely only on the client-side validation. And even with a framework like Next.js, you might still have issues because even though you fix your problem of blank screens by rendering the pages, you now have an even bigger dependency waterfall of downloading, parsing, executing the JavaScript, then hydrating the entire page before anything really works. And let's not forget the struggles of working with form in the Next.js pages router. So back then, you had to manually create your own API endpoints every time you wanted to safely submit a form to the server. You would want to use a library like trpc to ensure type safety. You might have to write a bunch of excess, messy code, especially to handle errors and loading states. So overall, it was not a good developer experience. So with the React Server Components, which was announced as RC at ReactConf in May, we now have server components. React Server Components will run only on the server, so therefore we can fetch data asynchronously inside components and access all our backend resources, which will reduce the bundle size by minimizing the JavaScript sent to the client and then let us build performant apps with an enjoyable developer experience. So what we want to do today is use React Server Components to write performant, user-friendly forms without a lot of front-end complexity. And we're going to need a framework to use RCs inside, and Next.js with the app router is our pick here. Then we will be needing multiple other React 19 features that are already available in the app router, which are server actions, the form component, UseActionState, useFormStatus, and useOptimistic. So the server actions are defined with useServer and tells the framework, like Next.js, to generate a post endpoint to a function. That allows us to call it from any component, for example, from a client component. It simplifies the communication across the server boundary while providing type safety with RPC. The form component is React's extension of the native form component, which now builds on top of its existing methods. The extension will let you create interactive controls for submitting information, for example, by letting the action property now also call a function. Typically, it could be a server action. So the function you pass will automatically be wrapped in transition, contain a hidden form data argument with the values of the form, and in the case of a server action, be called as an HTTP post. The useFormStatus hook is a hook that provides information about the last form submission. It can be used inside a form component, and a component inside a form, and it can be used, for example, to disable a button or display what's currently being submitted. This hook enables progressive enhancement because if the JavaScript has not hydrated the component, it will still work. It just won't display any pending feedback, as we see in the GIF here. UseActionState is another hook from React 19 that allows you to update state based on the result of an action. It also supports progressive enhancement by allowing the server's response to be shown without JavaScript before hydration has completed. This hook can be used, for example, to display error messages or other information that is based on the return value of the action. And the final hook is useOptimistic, which lets you optimistically update UI while the background operation completes. It lets you keep the UI snappy by providing instant feedback to interactions. And you can use it with server actions and form submissions, but it can also be used with other potentially slow operations, such as filtering based on route params. And it stands out because of its ability to seamlessly merge the client and the server state as the server finishes its update. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move on to the demo. I'm going to be coding a simplified version of something that I've made for my current consultancy project where we use RC. So let me just jump over to my code here. I need to reopen something here because it closed when I reset my, hold on 1 second here. And we're here, and we're going to go to localhost here. 3000. There we go. Okay. So I'm here in the Next.js app router, and I'm using Prisma as my ORM, and I have a local database, and I have Tailwind for CSS. So since we're in the app router, everything is a server component by default, and this is all server components here for this message box. So the message box component is a server component. It can be async, and it can asynchronously fetch messages from our database using Prisma. And then it's doing some nice styling and then mapping each message to individual message display components. And this is also just styling based on whether the user is the one who has written the message or not. And this is also just a server component. And finally, the message input, another server component, which is not really doing anything right now. I can try it out. Nothing's happening here. It's just an input. So what we want to do here is enhance this message box with React Server Components and React 19, where the goal will be to make this interactive while minimizing the JS on the client and reducing the frontend complexity. So let's begin by making this form work. So we're going to use React extension of the form component to bind this action property to a function. We're going to call it submit message. And it's going to be a server action. So I'm going to make it inside my actions libdata access layer here. And we're going to use a server action here. So we're going to say use server, which means that the content of this file will, the functions in this file will have a hidden post endpoint generated, and we can call them from anywhere. And we're going to export an async function called submit message, which takes in a form data argument of type form data. And what this means is that each field in this form will be submitted with its value inside the form data object on submission. And we can use this to insert into our database with Prisma. I'm going to create a message where the data will be, the content will be from the form data. And we also need a user ID here. Created by ID. And I'm just going to close this up. So somehow we need to pass an additional argument to our function. And you can do this in a couple of ways. You can use a bind or just pass it inside the form data. So I'm going to do a hidden input to pass the user ID inside the form data object. And I'll import the function and remove this console log. And it's worth noting that in the real world, you probably don't want to pass your user ID from the client like this, but this is just an example to show how you can pass additional arguments. So let's try it out just like that. I'm going to say, hey, and manually refresh the page, and it's been submitted. So it's just like that, manipulated my database. But I don't want to refresh the page manually, of course. So I'm going to use the Next.js API validate path with the root path, which means that I'm telling Next.js to purge the server component cache and regenerate whatever is on this path. So now I can say hi, and it's been submitted without a hard refresh there. Now, when I submit my message, I'm still in the scroll position where I don't see the new message. So it would be nice if I can make it interactive by automatically scrolling to the bottom when there is a new message. So I'm going to head over to the message box component, and I'm just going to change this div into an automatic scroller. And this component is a client component because it's using an effect and a mutation observer to listen for a new child in the container and scroll to the bottom. And this requires JavaScript, obviously, so it's a client component. But since I'm wrapping it like this around server content using the children property, I do not convert the content into client as well. And we can prove that by looking inside the React DevTools and see that there is an automatic scroller in the component tree, but there is no message display because only the automatic scroller has been shipped to the client as a component and has JavaScript. And let's see what it looks like now when we add a new message. I'm going to say hi. And it's now scrolling to the bottom with this interactive scroller here. So the next thing we should do is validate our data, because form data, it's from the client. It's we don't really know anything about it. So we're going to get a result from a message schema, which is a schema defined with SOD, which will at runtime validate or validate whatever it's being gets passed in to make sure that the content is at least one character and that the created by ID is a unique ID. So we're going to safely parse this object here that we were already using and use that to mutate our database. And we don't need to type these as strings because we're going to make sure that they turn into strings when we're done with this validation. And then we need to handle the case where this failed. So if the result is not a success, we can throw an error and say invalid message data, something like that. So now if I comment out my client-side validation and try to submit in a message, invalid message, I will get an error here because it didn't pass the validation. And you can do whatever you want with your errors, but a way to do it is by using an error boundary. So I'm going to make an error boundary around this message input and see how it looks now. So if it's invalid, the error boundary will catch my error and make sure that the whole app doesn't break. So let me just put back this client-side validation and get back to the submit message. Because maybe I don't want to throw an error, it's just a validation error. Maybe I would rather return something. So what I will do is I will return a success false. And I'm going to return a timestamp, and we're going to use this later. So I'm just going to create it now. Timestamp. That's OK, just like that. And I also need to return an error. We can just say, again, invalid message data, something like that. And then maybe you want to do something else on the server here. Maybe check that a user exists. Could be anything. In my case, I'm going to limit the amount of messages the user can send. So if, actually, we're going to get messages for a user and say await get messages for the user created by ID here. And if it's bigger or if there's more messages, then let's say 5. We can say user has to reach the maximum number of messages, success false, and return also the timestamp. And if all is well, we can insert into the database, validate the path, and then finally return success true. And if for some reason something goes wrong in this Prisma query here, I can just let my error boundary handle that problem. So I have a lot of server-side logic. Now I need to return this to the user somehow. So I'm going to use one of the new React 19 hooks called UseActionState. It will return. First, let's make this it will take in a function to call on trigger, or when the hook is being called, and an initial state. And the initial state can just be success false. And it will return a generated component state, which is equal to first the initial state, and then after that, the last return value of the action that UseActionState is wrapping. And it also returns a wrap action to calls, which is going to be called submit message action by convention here. And I can use this to replace on my form action property. And I can use the state to display an error message here. Should be error, excuse me. It should be error over here. Like that. Now I'm getting the error from the action. And there's a couple things I need to fix now. First, UseActionState is a hook. I need to tell the bundler to load the JavaScript for this component with useClient. And I need to update my function that I'm passing here, because UseActionState also passes a previous state argument to the function, which I'm just going to say previous state. I'm not going to use it now, but we need to put it there. And I'm just going to say message state here, so we don't have to write types in this talk. And all is good now. So let's see what happens. I say, hey, and then hi. And now I hit my max message count, and I will get the return value of the submit message function to my component here. And you could check for anything when you're doing returning something. You can maybe return each error value for the form fields, but I just have one form field here, so it's not really relevant in my case. But you could do that. The next thing that I want to improve is make it feel a little bit more interactive with this error message that I'm getting. So I'm going to use an effect to check if the state has an error. And if it does, I can just toast an error with that error. And it's going to need a dependency array, which is going to be the error, but also this timestamp that we created, so that every time the timestamp changes, we get a new toast. So now when we get an error, we're going to get also this toast here, which means I don't need my error message at the bottom here anymore. But instead of removing it, I'm just going to leave it as a no script fallback, which means that for some reason, if there's no JavaScript, you will still be able to see this error. Let's try fixing something else. So when I submit and I hit this max message count, my form field has been cleared. And the reason for that is because when you use React 19 form actions with uncontrolled inputs, it will automatically reset the form for you when the action completes, which is a good thing because it kind of mimics this MPA form submission behavior that we're used to in the more old ways of writing forms with the web. But in this case, I want to leave it there because maybe if my form had been different, the user would have been able to change this input or this value inside the input to something that would be valid and would submit. And I don't want them to rewrite whatever they just wrote. So what I'm going to do is when this error occurs, I'm going to also return the content. And what I will do is use this as the default value of the form. And maybe if you've been working with React Hook Form, you're used to making this controlled form state. Well, this is just uncontrolled inputs and default value. And now, if I try to type something, it will not reset my form. Or the default value will be the return value of the state. But what if the trip to the server and back is a bit slow? So that's realistic because I'm just using a local database here. It will take a bit of some time here for me to see the response. And maybe I would be accidentally submitting more messages, so I need to handle that somehow. And the UseActionState actually returns a third argument is pending, or a return third value. which I can use to disable my button and say something else here, like sending. What happened here? Let's try this again. Like that. So now when it's being slow, I will see that it's sending and I won't be able to click again. So let's just increase this max message count to 8 and see the full interactive message box again. So I'm going to just open this up and say, hey, and we'll see the sending, the automatic scroll, and the field form reset. And this is just so much easier to handle than the PageRouter form submission. But what's good here is this whole form will actually work without JavaScript. So let me just disable the JavaScript to see that. So I will say no JavaScript. And it worked. I didn't get any automatic scrolling. I didn't get any pending state, but everything still worked. Say no JS. It's working still, no JS. And then I hit my max message count and see this no script fallback. So I'm just going to turn this back on and refresh here and go back to my initial view. So what we've essentially been doing here is progressively enhancing this form, meaning ensuring all the basic functionality works at the lowest level of resources, and then which is no JavaScript, and then adding things on top to enhance the user experience for users with those resources available. So even if your user's on a slow device or a slow connection, they don't have to wait for JS to download, parse, and execute. They can use the form while the page is still hydrating. And since we reduced the JS on the client by limiting the JS in this automatic scroller, the JS that we do want will load a lot faster. There is, however, one more improvement that I can make to this code. So what I can do is I can extract this button into a submit button. So I want this to be a composable and reusable way to get pending state of a form. I'm going to say send here, and I'm going to make it inside my UI components. And I'm just going to paste whatever was there inside here. And I need to get this pending state from somewhere. So I'm going to use the new hook, use form status. And it will return a couple of things. You will get some data, you will get a pending and a couple other things, but we only need the pending here. So I'm going to put that on my button. And this has to be a client component because this is a hook. And it also needs some props, which is going to be the children. And if it's pending, we can render a nicely styled div with the spinner and the children. And otherwise, we will just render the children. Let's see if I can make this correct. I think that's good. There we go. So let's try to import it and see if it works. And I'm going to say hi. And it's now using this submit button, and it's handling everything for me. The loading state is just there. I'm just using a submit button. And what's so great about this is I can throw this into any component. Like I can go to the message box and just toss it in there, make a form with an action to reset my messages. And I can just make an inline function here. Reset messages, it's going to be a server action. It's going to be slow. It's going to delete messages from my database, and it's going to revalidate the path. And if I now import all the things that I need, and there we go, we can see what happens. So this is a server component. I don't have any use client here, and still this submit button is handling the entire interactive feedback here for me. And one more thing I want to show is the use optimistic. So let's just get rid of all this code and jump over to an optimistic branch really quick. And in here, I haven't done that much, but I've made a messages component, which is client component because it's using the use optimistic hook. And what this does is take in a state to show when no action is pending, which is going to be our truth from the server, and an update function, which says that an optimistic message will have an is sending true. And then I'm going to pass the function to update, to trigger the optimistic update to my message input, and also use the optimistic messages for my display. And in the message input, I'm just doing the optimistic update in an onSubmit while leaving the action as a fallback. So let's just see how that feels. When I say, hey, I'm getting optimistic, everything's happening right away, and I get the sending here while the server is settling and replacing the client state with the message that does not have the is sending flag. Hi. And as you can see, we're having optimistic messages all resolving. I can send a couple more. And when I hit my max message count here, the optimistic message will be rolled back because it does not exist in the server state. And this is all still progressively enhanced, by the way. So of course, depending on the app, you don't have to make progressively enhanced forms or anything like that. But now, by using these more primitive features of React 19 with React Server components, we can make our forms very robust while maintaining a great user experience. And these are probably going to be used as primitives for other library authors to make, for example, form libraries that make it easier for us normal developers. I'm almost done here. I'm just going to quickly round it off by saying that form actions exist in other frameworks as well, but now we have them in Next, and it's great. We can do a lot more than we could before with a lot less code, sorry. And the repo for the demo is here on GitHub, and then the optimistic update is in a branch if you want to check that out. And references, most of what I've done is just from, it can just be found in the docs. And the React docs have more in-depth explanations, and also considering the client side more than just the server, than the Next.js docs. Yes, I have a Twitter. I post RC there, excuse me, RC stuff there, and a blog. So if you're interested in learning more, check that out. Thank you.